Welcome to the Module 3 Implementation Research online phase. In this module, we will discuss study design and research method which usually used in implementation research. Here, we will walk you through different study design in implementation research, which are non-intervention and intervention study design. And also, we will discuss about quantitative and qualitative approach and also mixed method, which commonly used in IR project. And then we will also walk you through data management, data analysis, and data presentation of IR. There are two key concepts in the study design of IR. First is the non-interventional study, and the second is the interventional study. In non-interventional study, we have also two different study design. First is the descriptive studies, which mostly describe the implementation barriers and processes. And we can use both qualitative study, different type of qualitative study, but also quantitative study, which mostly use cross-sectional survey. In the analytical studies, we try to explore different causal pathway of determinants of implementation problems. We can also measure IR-related outcomes over time. And here, we use mostly cohort study design or case control study design. In the intervention study, there are several experimental studies which are commonly used in implementation research. For example, quasi-experiment, pragmatic trial, stepwise randomized trial, and adaptive design trial. This by no means is an exhaustive list of different study design used, but this is more about commonly used study design in implementation research. I will describe one by one these different study design. When we talk about experimental study, we mostly discuss randomized control trial or RCT as we know it. In RCT, we are interested to find a causal pathway between exposure and the outcome. Or if we talk about intervention, it's the efficacy of the intervention. But in IR, on the other hand, we don't really interested in the efficacy, but the effectiveness of the intervention. In this sense, we want to provide evidence of external validity, or in other words, is the generalizability. To do that, we need to have a study design which reflect the real world situation, while in RCTs, we try to develop situation in an ideal situation and in a control setting. So when we talk about pragmatic trial, for example, the setting is not a control setting, but in usual clinical practice or in the community setting for quasi-experiment. And because we want to have ideal circumstances, in RCT, for example, we try to select a participant using extremely restrictive criteria, while in pragmatic trial and also quasi-experiment, we try to minimize those criteria. In RCTs, for example, we use the placebo as a control group. But because placebo is not used in everyday practice, for pragmatic trial and quasi-experiment, we don't compare the intervention with placebo, but we compare the intervention with the existing standard care in those clinical settings or standard intervention which is exists in a program, for example. And here, we give the intervention according to fixed and protocol driven, while in pragmatic trial, we have more flexibility of the intervention, try to accommodate the existing setting, and in quasi-experiment, usually it's a bit more fixed and protocol driven. The stepwise cluster randomized trial is another experimental design which commonly used in implementation research. Here, participants can still be assigned to different treatment groups, but all the participants will have the intervention eventually, but the time of intervention will be decided randomly by the researchers. The benefit of the design is that the participants can be the control for themselves, because we already monitor some of the participants before the intervention are given. So here also another benefit is that we can also learn from the implementation of the interventions, because we also do the implementation step-wise, and we can learn from the previous implementation, and we can improve the implementation process. The adaptive design trial is another experimental study design which is commonly used in implementation research. The basic idea of this design is similar to the crossover design in the randomized control trial, whereby participants can be assigned to different treatment arms during the study period. But in adaptive design, the different assignment is decided according to the response to the intervention. For example, if there is a beneficial response of the participants, it can go to trial 2, and here if there is no response from the participants, it can go to trial 1B, which is an additional intervention in this participants group. And after several periods, we also measure the outcome. If there is a beneficial outcome, then we can go to the next trial, but if there is no positive findings, then they will have additional intervention. So here, we can add or adapt the intervention according to the needs of the participants, because the way they respond to the intervention or not in the study. The benefit of this study design is that the researchers can adapt and modify the intervention according to the needs of the participants, because the way they respond to the intervention. And this is something that we commonly find when we implement some intervention. There are some groups which respond properly to our intervention, but there are some groups which respond poorly to our intervention. And if we can modify the intervention in the poorly response group, then we can also improve the outcome of the intervention. Before selecting study design, we need to take into account these several factors. First, what we know about the problems, and then the second is also the nature of the problems and the type of objective of study that we want to do. And also we have to consider the available resources that we have, and also the ingenuity and creativity of the research team. These factors will influence what type of study design we can use in the implementation research. Another consideration when we select the study design is related to the research question that we want to ask in the study, and that's related to the stages of the project. Implementation research usually has 3 phases. First is when we develop the interventions, second, during the implementation phase, and that's the expansion of the intervention. In the development of the interventions, the questions that we want to ask is that, can the intervention works? While in the implementation phase, the research question become, does the intervention works? And during the expansion phase, the research question will focus on, will the expansion works? So these different research questions also require different research design. We also need to think about the study outcomes. In implementation research, there are several study outcomes that we can measure. For example, acceptability. These outcomes measure the acceptability of the intervention for the intended users. We can also measure the demand of the intervention in the intended user. We can also measure the implementation process. We can also measure the cost for implementation and adaptation of the intervention. And this is really integration of intervention into the existing health system. With that in mind, now we move to different research methods that we can use in implementation research. We can use either quantitative or qualitative research method, and we can also combine both methods into what we call a mixed method. The quantitative research method comes from the paradigm of positivism of the natural sciences, while qualitative approach comes from the paradigm of social sciences, which see the reality as a constructive participatory processes. And when we combine those methods, the research paradigm is we try to be pragmatic and use those both approaches to construct the reality. The difference in research paradigm between quantitative and qualitative study also influence the way we see reality and the way we conduct the study. For example, in terms of paradigm reality, quantitative design see that the reality is singular and context-free, while in qualitative study, the truth is multiple and context-bound, and the reality is subjective and socially constructed. In quantitative study, the researchers try to define the truth, while in qualitative study, the participants of the study is the one who define the truth. So we see the reality from the participant's perspective. And here, in quantitative study, the researcher become a miner of the data, while in qualitative study, the researcher act as a traveler where they share information and then construct reality. The differences also appear in the objective of the study. Quantitative study try to explain the causal pathway between exposure and the outcome, while in qualitative study, the objective of the study is try to explore the phenomena. In quantitative study, we do the measurement in objective way, while in qualitative study, the measurement is more subjective. For example, here, when we try to measure the time, is the time according to the watch, while in qualitative study, the time is the time that perceived by the participants. In quantitative study, the research tradition comes from the natural sciences, while in qualitative study, the research tradition comes from the social sciences. In quantitative study, the sample represents the population from which the sample are selected. In that case, the sample size will influence the representativeness of the samples from the population. On the other hand, in qualitative study, sample does not represent population. In qualitative study, sample represent the phenomena. In that case, we want to select sample participants with rich information so that we can capture the overall phenomena in the study. In quantitative study, we use standardized instrument because we want to measure the reality as objective as possible. But in qualitative study, because we want to measure the reality according to the participant perspective, we use the researcher as the instrument for the data collection. In analysis, we use statistical analysis in quantitative study, while in qualitative study, we use thematic and narration for analyzing the reality. Additionally, we also need to consider the strength of limitation of both methods. For example, the strength of quantitative study is that we can have a wide coverage of study, we can do it fast and economical, and that the statistical significance is relevant for policymaking. On the other hand, there are several limitations in both methods. For example, quantitative study, because of the study design, it can be inflexible and artificial, for example, in randomized controlled trial. It's also difficult to understand process or significance of actors to action, and it's not very helpful to generate theories. The limitation of qualitative study involve in very tedious data collection and its complex processes, and some people think that the qualitative study is not scientifically enough because it doesn't have the statistical significance, and thereby it lacks of generalizability. So we already talked about quantitative and qualitative study. So when do we need to use mixed method? There are several conditions that we can use mixed method. For example, that we want to have a triangulation. Here that we want to confirm the findings with different study design, so that if we have similar findings, then it confirms the reality. We can also use the mixed method as a complementarity, whereby we want to elaborate result from one approach with another approach. And we can also use the different method in the development process of the study. Here, for example, we can use the qualitative study to explore different variables, and that can be used to develop instrument for quantitative study. We can also use this mixed method as an initiation. Here, if you discover or expect something new or contradictory in one method, you want to explore more with different method. So that, for example, we find something different with the previous finding in quantitative study, and we want to know why the study findings are different. And then we use qualitative studies. We can also use the mixed methods as an expansion for maximizing understanding. For example, we want to know how big is some phenomena. So when first we do a qualitative study, we explore the phenomena, and then we expand with the quantitative study to understand how big is the phenomena in the population. At last, we also need to assess the quality of both methods. Some people think that qualitative study is not as scientific as quantitative study because of several issues. For example, sample size, statistical significance, and also the objectivity of the measurement. But in fact, there are several criteria that we can use to compare the quality of both methods. There are 4 issues that we can use to compare the scientific quality between quantitative and qualitative studies. For example, we can measure the truth value. In quantitative, we have this validity or internal validity parameter. In qualitative study, there are similar criteria, what we call credibility, and this relates to the questions whether we do measure what we are supposed to measure. We can also measure the applicability of this finding. In quantitative, we know the generalizability or external validity. In qualitative study, there are also criteria for that, which what we call transferability. And that relates to the question whether the research can be repeated in different subjects or different contexts. There are also issues of consistency, which in quantitative study we know about reliability. In qualitative study, the criteria is known as dependability, and this relates to the question whether the research can be repeated with the same result or not. And last is about neutrality. In quantitative study, we know that as objectivity, while in qualitative study, we know it as conformability. And that's related to the question, how far does the personal interest of the researcher influence the result of the study? So as the reflection activities, after we discuss about study designs, different research method, and the paradigm behind it, I would like you to discuss in your group in regard your research question and study design, what kind of research methodology or combination of both methods you will use in your research project. And with that, I thank you for your participation.